Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar today, sponsored by the Kauffman Foundation, What New and Small Businesses Need from Policymakers in COVID-19. Today we have a great lineup of speakers for you. One of the ways that you can interact with our speakers is by putting your questions in the audience chat box in the lower left part of your screen. Please take a moment to put in your state and city where you're watching from today, just to make sure we know where you're coming from, and hopefully we've got a good audience from around the country. I am going to turn it over to Jason Weens to get us started. Jason.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to our webinar today, What New and Small Businesses Need from Policymakers in COVID-19. My name is Jason Weens. I have the privilege of serving as Policy Director at the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, which is a private grant-making foundation with a $2 billion endowment that does work in two areas, education and entrepreneurship. With me today on the webinar are Caroline Cummings, Executive Director of Oregon RAIN, and Meagan Forbes, Legislative Counsel for the Institute for Justice. Both Oregon RAIN and the Institute for Justice are members of the Kauffman-led Start Us Up Coalition, a movement to build support for policies that help all entrepreneurs start and grow businesses. The 190-plus members of Start Us Up are located in 37 states, and you can learn more about the Start Us Up Coalition and the work we're doing by visiting our website, www.startusupnow.org. So to kick off the webinar, I'm going to speak in a few minutes about some of the challenges that are facing entrepreneurs and the America's New Business Plan response, which is a policy roadmap developed with significant input from entrepreneurs across the country. After that, we'll hear from Caroline and Meagan, who will join me to talk in more detail about ways states can support entrepreneurs both now and in the future. We'll then address some questions that you have before concluding with resources to help you take the next step to level the playing field for all entrepreneurs. I want to start by talking about why entrepreneurship matters. Now, I think there are many reasons why one might care about entrepreneurship, including how entrepreneurship contributes to innovation or how entrepreneurship is a means of self-determination. But one of the most compelling reasons, I believe, to support entrepreneurship is what you see displayed on the chart, and that's job creation. New and young businesses, those that are less than 5 years old, are responsible for creating nearly all of the net new jobs in the United States. And that fact has been true in both good economic times and bad. Meanwhile, on the other hand, older businesses tend to destroy more jobs than they create. So at a time when we have now, more than 11 million Americans without work, we need entrepreneurs now more than ever. But even before the COVID-19 crisis, American entrepreneurship was in trouble. For the last 20 years or so, the rate of new entrepreneurs in the United States has been essentially flat. America's entrepreneurs are today on the front lines of the battle to preserve and rebuild our economy. And we believe at the Kauffman Foundation, and this is a belief held also by the members of the Start Us Up Coalition, that we can't afford to go back to the old economy, the economy that we left behind in February. We have an opportunity that we need to take advantage of now to rebuild better. So throughout the webinar today, we have a few questions that we want to pose to you all to get your take on issues that are impacting entrepreneurs. And our first poll question is this: would you say that women, rural residents, and entrepreneurs of color have equal access to funding and opportunities as other new businesses in your state? The poll question should have appeared on your screen. Take a second, please, to register your response about access to entrepreneurial opportunities and whether you believe those have been equal or if there are disparities that you're seeing in your state when it comes to certain populations. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond to the survey, and then we'll talk a minute about the results. All right, well, thank you to those who are responding. The answers are coming in, and what we see based on your responses is what we have also discovered in our work at the Kauffman Foundation. Perhaps this is not a secret. Almost 80% of you said, no, women, rural residents, and entrepreneurs of color have not had equal access to the same funding and opportunities as other new businesses in your state. And as I said, that's what we have found in our work at the Kauffman Foundation. We believe it's one of the two contributing factors to the stagnant rate of entrepreneurship that we see in our country. Women, people of color, and rural residents do face extra barriers when it comes to starting their own businesses. Aspiring Black entrepreneurs in particular start at a significant disadvantage due to decades of past policies that have left them with less wealth and restricted their opportunities. Earlier this year, the Kauffman Foundation did a poll, and we asked folks how easy it was for them to start their business. In that poll, about 1/3 of all men said that it was very easy for them to start a business, but only 15% of women said the same, and the numbers were even lower for entrepreneurs of color. All right, so we're going to ask you a second question now. And the second question is, would you say your state has historically paid more attention or given more support to big business or to new and small business? So same process, the question should come up on your screen, register your response, and in a few seconds or so, we'll talk about what that looks like. The question again, would you say that your state historically has paid more attention or given more support to big business or new and small business? All right, thanks for those of you who are answering the question. The answers are coming in, and most folks are saying, again, that they have seen in their state has given more attention and support to big business rather than new and small business. So I'm glad that we are on the same page because that's our experience and what we have seen in our work as well at the Kauffman Foundation. It's a second contributing factor to the stagnant rate of entrepreneurship that we see in our country. Policymakers in general have tended to prioritize support for big established businesses over new and small businesses. And when you look at polling data, this is a fact that most people know about. Polling shows that majorities of both entrepreneurs and everyday voters believe that government prioritizes support for big business over small business. And since COVID, the economic climate for new and small businesses has only gotten worse. For me, I think this is one of the most egregious examples of government support for big established businesses, and that's the practice of handing out billions of dollars every year in subsidies to attract or retain large corporations. State and local policymakers that I've talked to over the years who have
Sounds like we lost Jason's audio. I know he's dialing back in right now, so hang in there.
Yep, sorry about that, everyone. Just a little bit of technical difficulties. We'll get Jason back on here in just a moment.
This is Jason Weens again. Hopefully you guys can hear me again now. I'm sorry, my call dropped, and it wouldn't be life in the Zoom age if I think we didn't have some technical challenge associated with the webinar today. So apologies for that few minutes of confusion, but we're back on. And I think where we left off was talking about this issue of, or practice of states and cities spending billions of dollars as we look out across the national landscape to attract or retain businesses. And what I've experienced in conversations I've had privately with policymakers is that many of them express frustration about this economic development practice, but they fear losing out if their city or state doesn't participate. So what I would say to the policymakers who we have on the webinar today, if it's not possible to stop offering incentives to big established businesses, states should at least dedicate more funding to support homegrown entrepreneurs. To level the playing field for all entrepreneurs, the Kauffman Foundation released America's New Business Plan last fall. It's a bipartisan roadmap for policymakers to support entrepreneurship. And our four-part plan contains policy recommendations for federal, state, and local government that ensure anyone with an idea has access to the opportunity, funding, knowledge, and support to turn their idea into a reality. America's New Business Plan is informed by public polling and surveys of entrepreneurs, as well as conversations we had with nearly 50 leaders in the entrepreneur community, including successful and well-known entrepreneurs like Steve Case. We also, of course, consulted the research literature and data to make sure that the content and the policy recommendations in America's New Business Plan were really grounded in evidence. And as the slide says, because of this deep work we did engaging with the entrepreneur community, America's New Business Plan is really a plan by entrepreneurs and for entrepreneurs. Just a few months after the release of America's New Business Plan, as we all know, the COVID-19 crisis hit, exposing the fragility of many new and small businesses across the country. Before the crisis, nearly half of all businesses lacked the financial reserves to last more than a few weeks, and more than a quarter were unprofitable. This contributed to unprecedented declines in business activity. Some 3.3 million new and small businesses closed between February and April this year, some temporarily, others permanently. And this was the largest recorded drop on record. And like the COVID-19 health crisis, there has been a disproportionate impact on entrepreneurs of color. From February to April, the number of African American business owners declined by 41%, twice the drop in active business ownership as among whites. And during the same period, the number of Latinx business owners dropped 36%, which represents more than 1.1 million businesses. To address the specific and urgent challenges facing new and small business owners now, we also released this spring Rebuilding Better, a response to the COVID-19 crisis. Rebuilding Better takes the ideas in America's New Business Plan and presents policies that will help in the short term, as well as the longer term, to ensure a more equitable, competitive, and vibrant entrepreneurial economy. And like America's New Business Plan, Rebuilding Better is organized around four key themes reflecting what entrepreneurs need: opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support. So let me talk now about each of those key needs or themes in turn. Starting with opportunity, which is about how do we create a level playing field with less red tape for new and small business owners. You know, in normal times, burdensome red tape makes it expensive and difficult to start and run a business. Now, however, red tape threatens to put out of business millions of entrepreneurs who can't navigate the complexities of government. As states develop and implement recovery plans, cutting red tape must be a priority in the short term. In the longer term, we believe states should replace occupational licensing with less onerous forms of regulation, and restrict the use of non-compete agreements, among other actions. The second pillar is knowledge, the know-how to start a business. Underserved entrepreneurs have fewer connections to relevant resources than other existing business owners do. States should develop policies that help entrepreneurs get the skills and know-how they need in a way that is culturally specific in the short term. And in the longer term, they should look to expand entrepreneurial skill building in their workforce development programs, as well as K through 16 education. The third pillar is funding, equal access to the right kind of capital everywhere. This stat may be surprising to some. I know it was to me when I first heard it, but at least 83% of entrepreneurs do not access bank loans or venture capital when launching a business. States should take aggressive action to create equal access to the right kind of capital, especially for female, minority, and rural entrepreneurs, including in the short term by expanding access to funding through CDFIs. And in the longer term, we believe states should do things like create evergreen investment funds that support new businesses. And finally, the last pillar, support, the ability for all to take risks. The lack of a safety net has become apparent over the last few months across all of society, but it has always been there for new businesses. States should identify policies that contribute to a comprehensive safety net that supports entrepreneurial risk-taking both now in the short term as well as in the longer term. So now that you've learned about the 4 pillars of America's new business plan and the needs they reflect, we have another poll question for you. And that question is, what do you see as the biggest barrier to starting a new business in your state? So the question should come up on your screen, and we're asking you to think about the 4 themes or pillars: opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support. And from those, which of those seems to be the biggest barrier that you're seeing new and small business owners face in your state? So register your response, please. I think all of these are, I know all of these are significant barriers entrepreneurs are encountering across the country. But if you had to choose one as the biggest barrier, would it fall within the opportunity pillar, knowledge, funding, or support? So folks are answering the question. Thank you for registering those responses. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to share your opinion on this. All right, so we have
Oh, we lost Jason again. This is Caroline Cummings, Executive Director of Oregon RAIN. I appreciate you guys hanging in there while we handle some technical difficulties. I also just wanted to give, while we're waiting, I wanted to give a shout out to Melissa Leone, who's here in Oregon with me. We haven't met, but I really appreciate you showing up and representing Oregon and learning more about these barriers that entrepreneurs are facing and the opportunities outlined in the America's New Business Plan. The results that I'm seeing on the poll that Jason just queued up, it looks like the highest, well, there's actually a tie between C and D: funding, unequal access to the right kinds of capital, and then support, inability to take the necessary financial and social risks. So it sounds like Jason is back. Jason, I was just sort of giving an overview of the poll results.
Thanks, Caroline. I appreciate you pinch hitting. Verizon doesn't like me today, and it's funny, I'm not even in a remote area. I'm calling from Kansas City today. So again, apologies to our participants. Thanks, Caroline, for pitching in, and thanks everyone for registering your thoughts on the biggest barrier that you see in your state that's facing new and small businesses. So now we're going to move into, yeah.
Sorry, it sounds like the results aren't viewable to the audience.
Okay. Meagan at NCSL, if you could, it'd be great to share those results with the audience. Thanks, Caroline.
Yep, I shared them, and if you can't see them, I apologize. I don't know what the technical difficulties are, but they should be showing up on your screen because it's saying I sent them.
Thank you. So I appreciate the chance to have shared with all of you a little bit about some of the challenges that are facing new and small business owners, and to talk about America's New Business Plan, the policy response that we've created with input from entrepreneurs around the country to address these challenges by focusing on opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support. And we believe that for legislators and other policymakers, as you focus on these areas, you can unleash the job-creating power of entrepreneurship for all communities in your state. So we're going to transition a bit now and move to the panel portion of the webinar. And I'd like to start by inviting Meagan from the Institute for Justice to introduce herself. And then, Meagan, could you give us a sense of the current regulatory landscape and talk about some of the barriers that are facing entrepreneurs?
Sure. Thank you, Jason. Hello, everyone. My name is Meagan Forbes. I am Legislative Counsel at the Institute for Justice. We're a nonprofit public interest law firm that works across the country to protect civil liberties, including the ability to earn a living. I work with entrepreneurs and small businesses at state capitals across the country, and I'm often working with them to lift unnecessary regulatory barriers to earning a living. A large focus of my work is helping to increase economic opportunity, especially for people who are trying to climb the first rung of the economic ladder. What we're seeing right now is really unprecedented. We're facing an economic crisis in the midst of a health crisis, and millions of people are still unemployed. They're going to need to re-enter the workforce at some point. And I know for almost everyone, preferably that would be as soon as possible. And in order for them to do that, we need to make sure that unnecessary regulations aren't getting in their way. A lot of my focus has been on reforming occupational licensing laws, which affect about a third of American workers right now. There's a bipartisan consensus now that occupational licensing does a lot more harm than good, and unfortunately disproportionately affects lower income workers, women, and people of color. For those who might not be super familiar with occupational licensing, it requires government permission before you can work in a particular field or occupation. And to get an occupational license, people often have to jump through hoops like expensive training, testing, and fees before they can work. What we've seen at the Institute for Justice is that sometimes these hoops are not tied to health and safety concerns. And a lot of times, more often than not, they've been passed by special interests trying to fence out new competition and to make it more difficult for newcomers to get their businesses off the ground. So in the wake of COVID, I'm very concerned about laws that block entry to work and to starting a new business. Entry regulations are incredibly rigid at a time when our labor market should really be as flexible as possible to help people find work and access opportunity. And entry barriers like licensing laws really do hold people back. By removing these kinds of barriers, policymakers can help level the playing field, and especially level the playing field for people in communities that already face opportunity gaps. Right now, the way I see it, every job counts, every opportunity counts. We want to make it as easy as possible for people to find work and access opportunity. There are many sensible bipartisan things that I think policymakers can do to create opportunity in a COVID world. We've already seen some states respond to the pandemic by waiving certain regulations and licensing requirements, especially in healthcare fields, and when it comes to licensing fees and continuing education requirements. but there's a lot more that needs to be done to aid economic recovery. States should really look to cutting red tape to give small businesses the flexibility they need to stay afloat right now and to adapt to the pandemic and the crisis that we're in. I'm looking forward to talking more today about the type of reform that's possible.
Thank you, Meagan. I appreciate that introduction and look forward to digging into some of those topics more in the coming minutes. But now I'd like to bring Caroline into the conversation. Caroline, can you please introduce yourself and speak about the importance of equipping entrepreneurs with the right kind of knowledge, as well as perhaps talk some about the role of entrepreneur support organizations in building sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystems?
Yes, thank you, Jason. My name is Caroline Cummings. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon RAIN. We are a 501c3 nonprofit in Oregon that exists to reduce barriers to entrepreneurship and innovation, in particular in small and rural communities who typically have very high challenges and barriers in accessing knowledge. And then if they do have access to knowledge, really sort of understanding if it's the right kind of knowledge for their businesses. I don't know how it is for other states, but in Oregon, the rural-urban divide is real, and a lot of the knowledge-based centers exist in more of the metro areas. So for Oregon, that would be Portland, Bend, Eugene, and Corvallis, also where there's universities. So in order to create sustainable entrepreneurial economies, there has to be the right know-how. So things that I would suggest is funding entrepreneur support organizations who are already in those communities and have trust with the entrepreneurs, in particular, the overlooked entrepreneurs. So I like to call them, overlooked and underestimated. The women, people of color, people in rural, people with disabilities who typically they need a lot of trust building before they will trust government organizations in particular who have funding resources. So for example, when COVID hit here in Oregon, the emergency funding did not make it down to the rural entrepreneurs, people of color, the folks I mentioned earlier, those populations. And it wasn't for lack of trying, actually. They did apply and they were looked over. And then when round two came through, some of them received it, but not all. And then in our state, there was emergency funding put together, but the barriers to accessing it were so high because of some restrictions around you couldn't access those emergency funds unless you didn't receive paycheck protection or EIDL funds. So the rural entrepreneurs, people of color who have connections to the right know-how, to the knowledge base, to the individuals who have this information can help reduce those barriers. So those are some of the suggestions that I would make, and in particular, providing any opportunities to provide more grants, not loans. That's the last thing these businesses need to be able to keep their doors open during COVID and beyond COVID.
Caroline, thank you for that introduction. Maybe, Caroline, I'll stay with you for a minute. I use the term entrepreneur support organizations. You may have used that term as well. For folks who might not be familiar, can you describe to us or define what is an entrepreneur support organization?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, for example, we are an entrepreneur support organization. We exist to support the entrepreneurs in our communities who are hardest to reach. Those of you probably more familiar with the SBA's Small Business Development Centers, the SBDCs that are all over the country, they are also considered entrepreneur support organizations. They're probably the most well-known that folks would know, but in every state, I bet you there are entrepreneur support organizations that are off the radar of policymakers because oftentimes those entrepreneur support organizations are being run by entrepreneurs. Jason, if you don't mind flipping over to my Boulder Thesis slide, I think when you're looking at entrepreneur support organizations, This thesis was created by Brad Feld out of Boulder, Colorado, who's arguably one of the best entrepreneurial catalysts in the country, if not world. He created Techstars, the most popular accelerator program, and has partnered with several different stakeholders in the world and entrepreneur support organizations. And these 4 tenets really need to be existing in order for the entrepreneur support organizations to be effective. That is, they need to be led by entrepreneurs and supported by all of you, supported by government, supported by academia. Long-term commitment, so developing 15 to 20-year plans, inclusive of the community, so anyone who wants to play has a role, and it isn't sort of the old boys network, right? Anybody who wants to get involved is able to. And then lastly, there has to be a culture of entrepreneurship and innovation that these support organizations are creating, where they're activating the communities, not just behind the walls of universities, but they're out in the communities, in libraries, in granges, in cafes and pubs, and really creating that culture of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, great definition and overview of what an entrepreneur support organization is. At the Kauffman Foundation, we are located in Kansas City, but we fund projects that help entrepreneurs across the country. In recent years, we have run several different RFPs where we're looking to find really high-quality entrepreneur support organizations and programming that we can build up and expand and support. And for the folks on the call, to give them an idea of kind of the scale, Caroline, you mentioned, many of these organizations may be kind of under the radar, not known or well known by policymakers. These national RFPs that we've run at the Kauffman Foundation annually would get 750 plus applications. So there are many, many of these organizations, most nonprofits, that are doing great work on the ground, connecting entrepreneurs to resources, training, knowledge, and skills to help them grow successful businesses. So I'm going to, we'll switch gears and maybe jump around a little bit. If folks on the call or on the webinar have questions, put them into the chat. We'll try and get to those in a few minutes in the Q&A portion of the discussion. But I want to go back, Meagan, to you. You were talking about occupational licensing, and I think you mentioned something about how often these licensing regimes can disproportionately impact and harm people of color. What efforts, can you maybe talk more about that, and then any ideas that you and Institute for Justice have around what efforts would support women and entrepreneurs of color as we look to create, a truly inclusive economy post-COVID?
Sure. So the research is really clear that occupational licensing laws disproportionately affect women and entrepreneurs of color and really do create serious barriers to entering the workforce and starting new businesses. And, oftentimes what we see is that women and people of color are already facing an opportunity gap. And this is just something else, something additional that has to be overcome. And a lot of times these licensing requirements that have been put in place have been put in place with the intention of the special interests that have advocated for them of fencing out new competition and making it difficult to get started. So they actually work quite well in doing that. One thing that the Institute for Justice would really like to see more of is having legislators revisit many of these licensing laws and consider whether there are any less restrictive alternatives. And just to give you an example of something that states have done recently that's been more inclusive for people of color in particular is how states regulate African hair braiding. Right now, 30 states today exempt hair braiding from cosmetology licensing. And although it involves hairstyling and has a cosmetology flair, states have looked to the risk that it poses and have seen that it's safe. It poses a relatively low risk of harm to the public, especially when you think about the economic benefit that it can provide to braiders and their communities. So now we see that in the 30 states that have exempted hair braiding, there are a lot more hair braiding businesses, and it's also led to job creation and has been a stepping stone to other businesses, to higher education in some instances, and simply just to earning a good living. So we'd really like to see states try to encourage these kinds of entry-level opportunities, which can really be stepping stones to other opportunities as well. And I think it's something that's especially important now to think about in light of COVID.
Thanks, Meagan. I had flipped to a slide with some photos. Any stories that you can tell us maybe about an entrepreneur or entrepreneurs that Institute for Justice has worked with, and how you've been able to help them overcome some of these barriers and red tape that had been preventing their access to opportunity?
Sure. So looking at this slide, if you look at the picture on the right, there's a large group of young women, mothers, kids. That is a state of Minnesota where we recently worked to exempt bridal hair and makeup artists from cosmetology licensing. And it's really an example of people coming up with kind of an innovative business model that didn't quite fit the current regulatory environment, and the state not really knowing what to do with it. And what had happened in Minnesota was that there were over 1,000 women who had developed very profitable businesses delivering simple hairstyling and makeup services on location at weddings and other special events. And unfortunately, in Minnesota, the state cosmetology board had started enforcing the cosmetology laws against them after these artists had believed they had been exempt from licensing for a long time. So many people had already built successful businesses. They were doing very well. And then the cosmetology board actually sent cease and desist orders to a couple of these businesses, which caused a lot of fear among artists in the community. As you can imagine, many of the artists relied on bridal hair and makeup to provide for their families. It's what they love to do, and a lot of them really couldn't imagine doing anything else. But very few could afford to stop working to satisfy the licensing requirements that the state was wanting them to meet. And the requirements in Minnesota were actually quite burdensome to do bridal hair and makeup. Because they didn't quite fit the mold, pretty much every occupational license within the realm of cosmetology license applied to them. And the artist would have had to have completed 4,000 hours of training, pass 4 exams, become a salon manager, and actually get another permit on top of that, where they would have to register that permit before every wedding that they worked on with the cosmetology board. It really didn't make a lot of sense, and thankfully the Minnesota legislature saw the injustice and that this needed to be fixed, especially during COVID. They started advocating for this bill before the pandemic, but after the pandemic, it became very clear that the legislature wanted to protect those jobs and opportunities. And in a very bipartisan way, the legislature passed a law that exempted them from cosmetology licensing. So this is really a good example of how legislators can respond to the needs of entrepreneurs who are facing red tape and narrowly tailor regulations to protect the public without limiting opportunity. One thing that the legislature did in Minnesota was that they required a 4-hour sanitation course that you would have to take to qualify for the exemption. So keeping public health and safety in mind, the legislature included that sanitation requirement, but they didn't go as far as to create an entry barrier that wasn't necessary for these artists.
Thanks, Meagan. I'm going to return for a few minutes to the topic of entrepreneur support organizations. And what we found in our work at Kauffman about why these organizations are needed is that often folks enter into entrepreneurship without ever getting or having had the training that they need in their formal schooling to be successful as an entrepreneur. There are so many different challenges and barriers that an entrepreneur will come up against along the way in their entrepreneurial journey. And these entrepreneur support organizations are resources to the entrepreneur to help them meet and overcome these challenges. Caroline, any thoughts or suggestions you have for the policymakers on the call today about how they could plug into some of these entrepreneur support organizations in their own state or community?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and I want to also add that these entrepreneur support organizations, they're sort of unsung heroes because they are behind the scenes doing this work, these 4 pillars that you see, opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support. They're out there not only finding entrepreneurs, but they're catalyzing the ecosystem. So not just providing technical assistance to an entrepreneur who needs it, but for example, on our team, they're called venture catalysts. They're entrepreneurs who get invited into communities, and they then work with the state legislature, they work with the local elected officials, and they find what's missing, what needs to be spun up. So one way that policymakers can engage is really first to do the outreach, to find who those individuals are. Start using the terminology, asking your colleagues, reaching out to organizations and entrepreneurs, probably the entrepreneurs and the innovators that you know in your own backyard, and say, where do you go for support to help either start, to scale, to raise capital, to overcome barriers? And really, I mean, with COVID, you can say, who's helped you the most in COVID? And I bet you those are the entrepreneur support organizations or mentors who are connected to those entrepreneur organizations. So I think if you take if you jump in and take the initiative to interview entrepreneurs and innovators in your own backyards and find out who's been helping them, then you will get connected to the entrepreneur support organizations who desperately need sustainable funding, especially right now, because they are also small businesses, right? So that's one way. Another thing that I think would be interesting, if I was a policymaker here in Oregon, I would connect with one of the universities that has public policy degrees and get a group of interns who are master's students to do an audit of the policies in Oregon that they believe are hindering businesses to start or scale. And there's a interesting opportunity right now because of COVID, right? Like the landscape is different. So, for example, in Oregon, we have a policy that was passed that is to tax businesses who have at least $1 million in revenue on gross receipts, not on profit, but on actual revenue. And that is a huge barrier for small businesses in Oregon. So that would be a policy that you could look at and say, wow, I don't know if this is the right policy right now. Maybe this needs to be put on the back burner for a year or two. So really get a handle first on what policies exist that hinder starting and scaling, and then work with the entrepreneur support organizations in your own backyard to help make recommendations on changing that. And look to America's New Business Plan. There's already been a ton of research done. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. This is one area. And then I wanted to speak on rural, but I'll pause for a minute and see if there were any other comments on that.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. I love the point to the policymakers about asking the entrepreneurs. Find the entrepreneurs. Ask them, who do you go to? Where do you go to get your support? And letting those answers guide you to the entrepreneur support organizations. Caroline, we did get a question, I think, that came in a moment ago on the Venture Catalyst program that you mentioned in Oregon.
Yes.
Is that the same as SCORE? SCORE is a federally funded program where retired executives and business owners do mentorship to younger, newer entrepreneurs. Is that the same program or is it different? And if it's different, can you speak a bit to maybe how it's different?
Yes, absolutely. It's very different. The Venture Catalyst program started 10 years ago in Oregon, back when U.S. senators were allowed to appropriate funds for programs in their own community. U.S. Senator Wyden here in Oregon seeded the first Venture Catalyst in Bend, Oregon, with $300,000. A Venture Catalyst is an entrepreneur who's been there, done that, whose entire job now is to build entrepreneurial economies and go into communities. Well, first of all, you have to wait till you get invited in. That's a big piece, right? So I think that some of the rural programs I've seen that don't work is programs that do outreach in a community they're not invited into, and we've even heard outreach is a dirty word. It should be inreach, right? So the community first invites you in. Then we bring together stakeholders. The venture catalyst brings together stakeholders who care about the local and regional economy, and then listens. We like to say we shut up and listen. Before, you know, it's an investigative approach, not a prescriptive approach, because what one community needs is different from another community. So it has to be extremely community-based. And the venture catalyst is essentially an economic developer who also has built businesses, scaled businesses, maybe even has invested in businesses, does a map of all the assets in the region, and then starts spinning up programs based on what that community needs. For SBDC, the chambers, they become components of the ecosystem that businesses will get referred to by that venture catalyst, because their whole job is to connect the entrepreneur to people, programs, physical assets, capital, and spin up those programs if they don't exist in that community.
Thank you, Caroline. I want to remind the participants on the webinar today, if you have questions, put them into the audience chat, please. We'll try and get to those. Thank you to some of you who have already asked questions. As we can, we're trying to get to those in the course of our discussion. A few folks have raised the issue of rural. Caroline, you talked about this in your remarks as well as a challenge in Oregon. In the state of Missouri, where the Kauffman Foundation is located, we see this as well, where you have two big centers of gravity, metropolitan areas, Kansas City and St. Louis. A lot of entrepreneurial activity, at least that's made public, is surfaced that comes from those areas. But we know that entrepreneurs exist in all communities across the country. Entrepreneurship is especially important, I believe, in rural communities. Can you talk some about what you're seeing in Oregon, whether that's specific challenges that rural entrepreneurs face? One question came in and was asking you, is broadband the top need or challenge that rural entrepreneurs face? What are you seeing from the rural perspective?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, broadband is always an issue in rural communities in Oregon. We've been invited to serve Grant County, which is in eastern Oregon. The entire county, it's a very large county, only has about 5,000 people, and they submitted to get a grant from the USDA for broadband, and they didn't, and it does create tremendous barriers. But again, I would go back to finding that entrepreneur support organization who understands the Boulder Thesis. We call it, venture catalysm. People call it different things. And find out what is needed most in that rural community. And I can't emphasize enough the need to be invited in. Because if you're not invited in, then it seems like you're getting dropped in and you're there to be their savior. Nobody wants that. People want to have agency and ownership. But in Oregon, what's been profound is how one example is there were 8 rural communities across 2 counties that banded together. These are the state reps from those backyards, the city managers, administrators, mayors came together with the higher ed folks from the community colleges and the universities and said, we want to do this regionally and not just work on solving the rural entrepreneurial ecosystem in one city or one town, but it has to be done across borders. Our venture catalysts say there's no such thing as borders. The entrepreneur doesn't care where the city and county line stops. So finding out what's needed first before just launching is important. No cart before the horse. Just because you have an empty building in your downtown doesn't mean you need an accelerator in there. Maybe you do, but you have to wait and listen and find what's needed first for that specific rural community.
Thank you, Caroline. I love this idea as well about listening. It's one of the reasons why I believe America's New Business Plan can be such a valuable resource to policymakers. It's because of the work the Kauffman Foundation led, looking at public polling data, doing our own polls and surveys of entrepreneurs, talking to leaders in the community, looking at the data and what the research literature says. All of these things came together to inform the plan, and I think it's a reason why policymakers can be confident in the ideas and the pillars that we're talking a lot about today: opportunity, knowledge, funding, and support, as really key areas for policymakers to focus on. Again, I'll offer it up to folks in the audience. If you have questions, put those into the chat. Maybe a question to both Meagan and to Caroline, I'll pose to both of you. We've talked about on this call already today a number of different actions that policymakers can take to support entrepreneurs. One of the things that I think is really important for policymakers to understand is that entrepreneurship is a process. It's a journey that someone goes through. And so if a state puts in place, let's say, a program that helps entrepreneurs at the very start of that process of the entrepreneurial journey about launching a business, that could be really important and effective, but it may not be, and I would say often is not, the only thing that entrepreneurs need. So you can't just say, oh, we did our one thing for entrepreneurs and they should be good now, but you have to think about all the different supports that are needed across the process. And we've talked about a number of those in the discussion today. But for the policymakers, Meagan and Caroline, and I'll start with you, Meagan, if you were going to leave them today with just one thing, if you had to choose only one, what is the thing that you think is most important for them to take away from this conversation, or an action perhaps that they could pursue in their state?
Sure. So I think the one takeaway is really to think about whether we're regulating work in the least restrictive way possible to still protect the public, of course, but really thinking through whether the regulations that are affecting entrepreneurs and creating sometimes red tape are the least restrictive way of going about doing that. And I do have a slide that has the inverted pyramid of occupational regulation. Jason, if you could go to it, just to give everyone an idea of what I'm talking about. A lot of times, what we find at the Institute for Justice is that policymakers view occupational licensing as a binary choice, license or no license. And a lot of times policymakers don't realize that there are a menu of alternatives between a license and a no license that can protect against evidence of harm and protect the public without creating the entry barrier. So through using tools like the inverted pyramid of occupational regulation, policymakers are able to identify the harm and also look to see what type of regulation may be appropriate. And just to give an example, a lot of times with licensing, what the state is really trying to get at is sending a signal to consumers that a person has met certain basic qualifications to work or to start a business. But there's also the option of government certification where workers can meet the same requirements and get certified and then use certified when they're advertising their services and have their certification, but it doesn't create that same entry barrier that we see that hurts women and people of color so much. So I think that's a really good example to think about. Another example would be if sanitation is a concern, you can license the facility rather than the person and require inspections of the facility. We see that with the way restaurants are regulated, and it works really well. So these are ways just to think about how we can cut through red tape and ensure that we're not creating unnecessary barriers to work.
Thank you, Meagan. Great advice for the policymakers on the call. Caroline?
Yes, just really quickly, I know we're coming up to the top of the hour. One of the things I would do is check within your state and find out, is there a 10 or 20-year entrepreneurship and innovation plan in place, a sustainable plan in place? And is it truly inclusive? Does it include rural? Does it include people of color? Does it include people with disabilities and women? I think that's a good start. And if it doesn't exist, ask why. If it does, make sure that it addresses all the points that I mentioned earlier. A quick win, I think
Caroline, are you still there? I don't hear you.
list. Whoop, can you guys hear me? Am I still there?
I can hear you now. You're
okay,
still here.
Great. I had an alert pop up about the fires here. And essentially what the impact statement is a list of things that need to be considered when businesses are being created that would hinder their growth, like I talked about earlier. And this coalition that you're connected to with Kaufman, we're all working on that. So again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel on that. I think that would be a quick win, and make sure that you have a long-term strategy. A lot of legislators think in terms of bienniums because that's the way it runs, but this needs to be a 10, 20-year plan.
Awesome. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Meagan, both for your insightful contributions to the conversation today and for the work you and your organizations are doing to really reduce barriers to entrepreneurship. All right, so we're at the end of our time together. I want to thank everyone, but before I let you go, I want to share with you a few resources that can be helpful to you in your work so that you can begin acting on some of these ideas that you heard in today's webinar. The first is to sign up for the Start Us Up mailing list on our website, startusupnow.org. Simple and easy thing you can do to stay informed about the topics that we talked about today. Similarly, you can follow us on social media. We are at StartUsUpNow. And third, I encourage you to check out the Institute for Justice's new service for policymakers at 2021initiative.com. And finally, to conclude, I want to just leave you with this charge from America's New Business Plan. We need to empower all Americans dreaming of a brighter future by leveling the playing field, expanding access to capital beyond the few, fostering local ecosystems that provide entrepreneurs with practical knowledge, and providing the support necessary for entrepreneurs to take risks. Thank you to the National Conference of State Legislators and for all of you for your time today. We hope to be a resource to you moving forward. Take care.
Are we doing the